We never sort of think of ourselves as like out of tune. We think ourselves maybe out of standard tune. And we think it's sort of bolstering the tradition of rock to break out and freak with it, so to speak.
Sonic Youth were a band perhaps known more for their influence than their music. Formed in New York in 1981, they made their name on swirling avalanches of noise and guitars with odd tuning, breathing in a mix of no-wave, hardcore, 60s pop, pulp sci-fi, and B-movies. Their love for all kinds of popular culture was second only to their willingness to deconstruct the tropes of classic rock. By the end of the 80s, they had made that most pretentious of progressive rock ego trips, a double album, and with it, launched the next decade of alternative music. Noise and pop in equal measure. This is the story of Daydream Nation, and how Sonic Youth reinvented rock and roll. Growing up, each of the members of Sonic Youth were coming from a different place locationally and musically. Through his Connecticut adolescence, guitarist Thurston Moore bathed himself in the US punk of the Stooges, Patti Smith and the Ramones. Other guitarist Lee Ranaldo from Long Island relished the pastoral shimmering chords of the Grateful Dead. And bassist Kim Gordon, a Los Angeles exile, had soaked up a mixture of Joni Mitchell and freeform jazz. But the shared point of influx was New York and the dying reverberations of its no-wave scene. One of the biggest appeals of seeing and hearing no-wave bands in downtown New York was how purposely abandoned and abstract the music sounded. In a way, it was the purest, most free thing I'd ever heard. Much different from the punk rock of the 70s and the free jazz of the 60s, more expressionistic, and beyond, well, anything. In contrast, punk rock felt tongue-in-cheek, in air quotes screaming, "We're playing at destroying corporate rock." No wave music was, and is, more like, "No, we're really destroying rock." Its sheer freedom and blazingness made me think, I can do that. No wave as a movement was fleeting. The No New York compilation, produced by Brian Eno, documented the initial burst of abrasive energy, but due to the inherent self-destructiveness of the movement, most of the bands had broken up or changed direction by the time the album hit the shelves. However, the idea of destroying rock and roll, setting ablaze such accepted tropes as pop song structure, choruses and riffs, would be something that Sonic Youth would play with for the rest of the 80s. Another key figure in Sonic Youth's early days was Glenn Branca. Who not only funded and released the band's first two records on his Neutral label, 1982's Sonic Youth EP, and 83's Confusion is Sex. Shake off your flesh! Shake off your flesh! But recruited Moore and Ronaldo into his avant-garde guitar orchestra. Thanks to working with Branca, as well as an appreciation of Velvet Underground's ostrich tunings, Sonic Youth quickly learned that if they were playing in standard guitar tuning, the songs themselves would sound fairly standard. All we had were these very, very, very cheap electric guitars. A lot of them were no good at all for any kind of conventional playing. We tried tuning them different ways, find one thing we could do with a particular guitar or pair of guitars that would sound cool, and write a song around that. Not only were alternative tunings utilized, but the guitars would be augmented with screwdrivers through the neck to create a second bridge, or played with the aid of a drumstick, or in the case of Ronaldo, his favoured electric drill. Certain guitars would have 12 strings or make use of a whammy bar, but normally each guitar would only be used for a handful of songs. necessitating the band touring with at least a dozen guitars, which due to Moore and Ronaldo's unconventional playing and the instrument's shoddy construction, broke constantly. But not everyone could see the potential in Sonic Youth's early deconstructions of rock and roll. The dean of American rock critics, Robert Christgau, came down especially hard on their debut EP, giving it a C. At their worst, they sound like poly-rock mainlining metronome. At their best, like one of Branca's early drafts. The criticism hit Moore especially hard, as Christgau had been one of his heroes. In one of the Sonic Youth's best early tracks, Kill Your Idols, Moore chastised a friend for what he saw as sucking up to him, and what he represented. Robert and the Village Voice, the downtown New York City weekly he wrote for, were never sympathetic to Sonic Youth or the local rock scene in general, and the one night he came to one of our shows, someone in the audience tried to light him on fire, playfully though. Coinciding with Moore and Ronaldo being on the other side of the Atlantic with Branca's orchestra, their first tour of Europe got Sonic Youth their first decent reviews. However, there was one show in London in December '83, where everything seemed to go wrong. Opening a three-band bill with SPK and Danielle Dax, within a couple of songs they faced total equipment failure. Gordon snapped a string, Ronaldo's amp caught fire, and Bob Burt's drum kit started to collapse. Frustrated that his guitar had fallen apart in his hands, Moore started smashing bottles with it, and heaved a monitor at a bouncer. The curtains closed on him conjuring a torrent of feedback, while screaming insults at the sparsely packed English crowd. For this, they got rave reviews in British music weeklies, The Enemy and Sounds. To the UK press, with their guitar-forward noise, Sonic Youth sounded like a refreshing return to the manic energy of rock music, after the cool detachment of early 80s synth-pop. Because of this buzz, by the time they got back home, they started to play to actually receptive, sold-out crowds. However, they had begun to tire of their current setlist, so in a trademark act of anti-nostalgia, they started over fresh. We took all the strings off of the guitars, threw them around a little bit, put some new strings on them, and hammered them a little so that we had to write all new songs. The tuning on the guitars once we got through with them was so different that we killed our old songs. When we wrote a new batch of songs, they turned out to be more subtle. They were a little more laid back physically, more cerebral. Whether they were more subtle and cerebral may be, but the songs did hew closer to standard rock and roll, at least fleetingly. The Charles Manson fascinated Death Valley 69 even has identifiable MC5 style riffs. Amongst the growingly feral vocal back and forth between Moore and guest Lydia Lunch. Instead of the improvised noise of their early releases, Sonic Youth were not only pulling in hardcore punk, but also bands from their childhoods that have become resolutely uncool since the advent of punk. They even named their 1985 album after a Creedence Clearwater Revival song. Calling our album Bad Moon Rising was having fun with that, like the Replacements naming Let It Be after that mouldy stalwart of the 1960s. Speaking words of wisdom, let it be. Which was very ironic. Our title was somewhat ironic, but Creedence was significant as American music we thought was artful and ready to be re-evaluated, a reclamation of something that had been discarded by punk rock. With its ominous flaming scarecrow artwork, Bad Moon Rising would be their first studio album without Branca's backing, instead released in the US by indie Homestead. But due to increased interest in the band, as well as glowing write-ups in select broadsheets, major labels started to sniff around. Warners and Elektra asked for copies of the record because they'd read this great review in the New York Times. And then they got the record and called the label and said, "Are you sure this is the band we read about?" Drummer Bob Burt left the band after having grown sick of playing the entirety of Bad Moon Rising every set for a year, and was replaced by Steve Shelley of Michigan hardcore band The Crucifix. Thankfully meshing with Sonic Youth's revised direction. As they more frequently toured the West Coast, they became increasingly energized by the mutant hardcore being made across the country. The level of invention happening with those bands during the mid to late 1980s would become a sole inspiration, displacing almost everything else that had occupied our musical minds before. The creative energy shared at gigs and on recordings wiping our collective blackboards, with new alchemical configurations introduced. There was no more hippie, no more punk, no more art, no more hardcore, no more nothing. Only a ticket to create in a zone of liberation and promise. Moore had wanted the band to be on the influential indie label SST for a while, but one of their top brass, Joe Carducci, had sneered at the band's self-aware art rockness, vetoing their inclusion with the reasoning that record collectors shouldn't be in bands. But as soon as Carducci left the label, Sonic Youth was signed immediately. Their first album with the label was EVOL in May 1986. Moore would state that the songs were tamer than previous releases, and marbled with the songmanship of the replacements, but Sonic Youth style. Gordon believes it's their goth record, taking notes from Lydia Lunch and Nick Cave projects The Birthday Party and The Bad Seeds. People magazine stated that the album was the oral equivalent of a toxic waste dump. The album also stopped Mike Watt from quitting music.
Me and Mike Watt, we played for years. Punk rock changed our lives.
Formerly of the Minutemen, his bandmate D. Boone had died in December 1985 in a van crash while on tour, and ever since had been in a depressive funk. Sonic Youth invited him to play on their cover of Kim Fowley's Bubblegum.
Young and so much fun, life has just begun.
And the freeform Ronaldo penned In the Kingdom number 19.
The door sags open and a man covered in blood drops the 3 feet or so to the pavement.
The latter's beat-inspired tale of roadside death, being written with Boone in mind.
White light, blinded. Some guy there kneeling in the blinding mirage of white light.
It was the first time Watt had played bass since losing his comrade, and led him to form Firehose. Sonic Youth lore has it that Moore threw firecrackers into the vocal booth as Ronaldo was recording, the after effects of which can be heard on the track.
Fourth rocking motion coming to rest.
Shadow of a Doubt was one of the most startling revelations on the album, recalling the pocket melodramas of the Shangri-Las. It's a ballad half spoken by Gordon. Building from raindrop guitars to cacophonous conclusion. The band would often infuse their work with various shades of high and low popular culture, often all reading the same pulp novels and biographies while on tour. As such, Shadow of a Doubt lyrically takes inspiration from Alfred Hitchcock, though despite its title, it mostly dwells on his 1951 film, Strangers on the Train. It was also the second Sonic Youth song to have a music video, featuring Gordon made to look like she was sitting atop a moving train, and being that it was nowhere near as blood and guts soaked as their clip for Death Valley 69, it was their first to get play on MTV via late night indie showcase, 120 minutes. Though Moore, Ronaldo and Gordon all had songs where they assumed the lead singer position, the press, especially in the UK, were permanently intrigued by Gordon, forever asking her the same inane question: what's it like to be a girl in a band? The mostly male music press in the UK was cowardly and non-confrontational in person. They would then go home and write cruel, ageist, sexist things. I assumed it was because they were terrified of women. The whole country had a queen complex after all. I refused to play the game. I didn't want to dress like Susie Sue, or act out the role of an imaginary female, someone who had more to do with them than with me. There was a popular look at the time, the vintage dress, the makeup. That just wasn't me. EVOL ends with Expressway to Your Skull, a marked shift in their recorded output. Continuing with the Manson theming of Death Valley 69, but unlike that noise rock riff-a-launch, it was an almost elegiac sigh. Its opening line half sneered, half shrugged, while also a nod to a more murderous version of the Beach Boys, one where Manson actually made it into the band. After its almost anthemic first half, the pounding drums drop out for its atmospheric, time-stretched coda. Here, Sonic Youth kept the odd tunings, but were evolving beyond sheer noise. To spark some rock and roll confusion, on the LP sleeve the song wouldn't be listed as Expressway to Your Skull, instead as Madonna, Sean and Me, while on the lyric sheet it was named The Crucifixion of Sean Penn, both in reference to the 80s queen of pop and her new husband. This was the first indication of Sonic Youth's surprisingly sincere fascination with the material girl. By 1986, Madonna was one of the biggest things on Planet Pop. However, a few years prior, she'd been part of the same New York circles that Sonic Youth ran in, more claiming she'd been in no-wave bands with members of Swans, and hung out in CBGBs and Danceteria. While many of the other denizens of the underground dismissed her mainstream music as disposable radio trash, Sonic Youth, as well as Mike Watt, appreciated her star-making music videos, and her loving fusion of New York subcultures like punk, new wave, disco, hip-hop, and Latin pop. This led to the band playing Madonna songs on their boombox on stage in their tuning lulls, wearing her merchandise, and confusing their fanbase in the process. Furthering their appreciation, during the sessions for EVOL, Watt recorded a bare-bones cover of her first album cut, Burning Up. And Sonic Youth took on the irresistible dance pop of Into the... It's the difference between a very narrow vision and a very broad, encompassing vision. I mean, I can easily understand people's total revulsion with all of that pop stuff, but you grow up with pop culture, and there's no reason to turn your back on it. It's a lot of the fun of life. We have no pretensions about being way serious. We're just stupid. Their version paid little mind to copyright, often fading in Madonna's original for emphasis. Released as a limited run 12-inch under the name Chicone Youth, in reference to her discarded surname, when the single came out in the UK, their gnarly, dirge-like mashup became a surprise dance hit. but there were never any legal repercussions. With Sonic Youth's blessing, Madonna attained essential underground cool points. What followed was more touring, Sonic Youth continuing to embed themselves in the fabric of the US independent firmament. Each journey across the country gaining them a little more ground, a few more sales, and incrementally more packed shows. In March 1987, the band recorded their second album for SST, Sister. Its song structures crept closer to something that might get played on college radio, with less tangential wandering, was more hummable, a kind of noise-coated pop. The songs on Sister were mostly in the 3 to 4 minute range, lean, succinct, more focused than anything we had created prior. There was no discussion about it, no conscious decision to write in such a way, though touring with bands like Firehose, Saccharine Trust, and Dinosaur had likely steered us in that direction, taking us away from the extrapolations of Glenn Branca in favour of economy. On Sister, the band had moved on from Manson and Madonna onto sci-fi writer Philip K. Dick. The album's title alludes to Dick's twin sister, who died shortly after her birth, haunting his thoughts and work ever since. The album's opening track, the disharmonic new wave of schizophrenia, plays with this concept of lost siblings you never got to know.
His sister came over. She was out of her mind.
Partly this is a reference to Dick's sister, but also Gordon's brother, diagnosed with the titular mental illness when she was in high school. An inverse of Dick's situation, Gordon went from growing up and knowing her sibling to realizing she never knew him at all. Though because of Moore's obtuse wordings, none of this is immediately obvious.
Her brother says she's just a bitch with a golden chain.
The lyrics always mean something to me. They're always referencing something personal, something I'm interested in, or inspired by, but they're very much encoded for myself. I'm into that kind of linguistic play and surrealistic poetry. It creates a more open reading. Elsewhere on the album, they refine their noise pop. Catholic Block rocks something righteous. Bookended by harsh feedback and twee noodling. Cotton Crown is a rare duet between Moore and Gordon, a nod to the swirling Nancy Sinatra and Lee Hazelwood ballad, Some Velvet Morning.
Flowers are the things we know.
Angels are dreaming of you.
And the closest thing to a devotional love song they'd ever write.
Love has come to stay in all the way.
By this point, Moore and Gordon had been married for 3 years. This domestic bliss pleasingly contrasting with the riotous, no-rules rock and roll they were producing. Midway through Pacific Coast Highway, it suddenly switches from a Gordon-led Swan's-esque stomp to a passage of soft rock guitar escapism, inspired by Beach Boys' instrumental Let's Go Away for a While. Plus, for good measure, a cover of Hotwire My Heart by San Francisco proto-punks Crime, the kind of obscure pick that suited the record collecting band just right. I like Sister a lot. The Sister sound of the drums is kinda bad, but everything else sounds great. It's my favourite cover, I think. It's really funny because every record was sort of a landmark, and Sister was a landmark because that was the first record that Christgau liked. Released in June 1987, the album was the band's first to sneak into the top 20 of Village Voice's end-of-year Paz and Jop list. A not bad number 12 alongside R.E.M., XTC, and JAMC. However, despite this increased acclaim, things weren't working out with SST. Tricksy accounting and the label taking a quantity rather than quality approach to releases were concerning, but the most annoying thing was rocking up to the local record store while on tour and seeing that their records just weren't there. After Sister, we felt like we'd made this really great record and we'd be touring here in Europe and find that nobody could get it. We were really disappointed. We felt it was going to be more available than it was. So for their next record, they went with Enigma. In theory, it was still an indie, albeit a high-profile one, with a discography that included top 10 albums such as Poison's Look What the Cat Dragged In, as well as others like Christian rock band Stryper, and the Mute Records stable for the US market. But distribution, their sticking point with SST, was handled by major label EMI. But before recording their next proper album, the band spent some time off on another Chicone Youth goof. It was titled the Whitey album in reference to their doomed plan to cover the entirety of the Beatles' White Album, abandoned after learning back in the USSR and realizing the amount of work they'd have to put in for a joke. Instead, they borrowed a sampler and created a largely instrumental LP in the vein of German experimental bands like Can and Neu. But with occasional spoken word and hip-hop distractions. Bored by the less collaborative process of this music, Gordon went off to a mall karaoke booth and recorded a cover of Robert Palmer's Addicted to Love. Which, despite not having any of Sonic Youth playing on the track, made it onto the album, and even had its own budget promotional video. With this flight of fancy out of the way, the band began work on their magnum opus. While Sonic Youth were gathering increased acclaim for their recorded outputs, where they truly excelled was on stage. Rigorously touring since their early years, their shows were now expertly fluid meshes of guitar dissonance, reshaped on whim by Moore and Ronaldo's joint intuition, mentally in sync but orally crashing against each other. Songs like Expressway to Your Skull transformed into marathon exercises in hurricane leads, feedback drone, and free roaming experimentation. But as of yet, they'd never been able to translate that to record. So to make sure their next album had their trademark live fire, instead of recording demos, a month before they entered the studio, they did 4 weekends worth of live dates, playing only their new material. Smashing into shape in front of an audience, and searching for the most satisfying endpoints for these songs. Because of this, Daydream Nation is more kinetic, freeform, and works as a continuous piece of music. This is also why 5 of the songs are around 7 minutes long. Longer songs meant that they were pushing the limits of the standard LP, so they decided why not make it a double. As music historians themselves, Sonic Youth knew that the double album had the reek of unchecked ego, of moneyed excess, and progressive rock. But SST bands like Husker Du and the Minutemen had already dabbled in the format with the expansive Zen Arcade and Double Nickels on the Dime respectively. Why not do what they'd done with Bad Moon Rising and give their classic rock forefathers a knowing wink? We still thought it pretentious to have a double album. That's why we titled those 3 songs as a trilogy. and used the Zoso style symbols for each of the LP sides. It was our way of making fun of bands like ELP and Zeppelin, and ourselves. The band entered Green Street's basement studio in July 1988. Their engineer Nick Sansano, however, was not accustomed to working with rock bands, having made his name with Public Enemy. Sonic Youth, and especially Gordon, had a growing fondness for hip-hop, and had decided that a producer versed in that genre would give this new LP the dynamism their previous albums had lacked. I remember when Sonic Youth first came to the studio to check it out and meet me. I played Public Enemy for them.
I got a letter from the government the other day. I opened and read it. It said they were suckers.
Which is odd in a way. They were this noise rock band, but I felt like Public Enemy was the most important work that I had done, and they was representative of the studio and me. I always felt like with Sonic Youth and Public Enemy it was basically the same approach. This aggressive, multi-layered sound, this density. Musically they were pulling from everywhere, as well as their former label mates over at SST. Gordon had a hip-hop thing, Shelley had rediscovered Lee Hazelwood and Big Star, and Moore had gone back into thrash metal due to Slayer. For his 3 songs on Daydream Nation, his career highest thus far, Ronaldo had become obsessed with a particular live acoustic version of Bob Dylan's Visions of Johanna.
The ghost of electricity howls in the bones of her face.
And adopted its next level metaphorical phrasings for himself.
She's a beautiful metal jukebox, a sailboat explosion, the snap of electric whip crab.
But the band to have the biggest impact on the album, both musically and content-wise, was Dinosaur Jr. Having toured together over the last few years, their pedal-hopping alt-rock had been a revelation. The scuzzy, more guitar-heroic leads of Cross the Breeze recalls the whole grunge Van Halen deal of J Mascis. On Trilogy Closer, Eliminator Jr., they added their distorted shredding to an 80s ZZ Top shimmy, at the same time giving the song its title. But opener Teenage Riot was the most explicit nod, where Moore imagines Mascis as president. The riff I launched the song on was on a guitar-tuned G-A-B-D-E-G, conceived with the personal challenge of locating the essence of what I heard in Neil Young and J Mascis. Though the parallel will most likely be difficult for any casual ear to discern. The lyrics came from a similar place, the working title of the song originally being Rock and Roll for President.
Teenage riot in a public station, gonna fight and tear it up in a hyper nation for you.
An ode to the way the political energy of youth was swamped in commodity culture.
'Cause it's getting kinda quiet in my city head. It takes a teenage riot to get me out of bed right now.
A rabble-rousing call to action. It starts with Gordon's half-whispered slacker nursery rhymes. Its gently chiming chords wrong-fitting the listener for how much of a barnstormer the track is going to be. The same year, Dinosaur Jr. released Freak Scene, which in a pre-Smells Like Teen Spirit world vied for position with Teenage Riot as the de facto anthem for the alternative nation.
So fucked, I can't believe it, but there's a way I wish we'd see it.
J Mascis wasn't the only fodder for lyrics. For the sprawl, Gordon took its title from sci-fi author William Gibson's book, Neuromancer.
I grew up in a shotgun run, sliding down the hill. I fought with the big machines.
While its lyrics borrow heavily from Dennis Johnson's The Nicaraguan Revolution as Hell novel, Stars at Noon.
To the extent that I wear skirts and cheap nylon slips, I've gone native. I wanted to know the exact dimensions of hell.
Other songs of hers are charged with unease. The sleazy movie mogul of kissability.
You're so soft, you make me hard. I put you in a movie
and the queasy point of view of one of the preppy killer's victims on Eliminator Jr. When Daydream Nation 33 1/3 author Matthew Stearns asked Gordon what Cross the Breeze was about, she replied simply, "Flirting with Satan?" Ronaldo's song Eric's Trip took its first verse lyrics from the Andy Warhol film Chelsea Girls, specifically from Eric Emerson's monologue.
My eyes can't focus. And my brain is talking. Looks pretty good to me.
My eyes can focus. My brain is talking. It looks pretty good to me.
The swarm of bees sound that pervades the whole song was achieved by a very special guitar. Known as the Drifter, it was a cheap Les Paul copy that had been with the group since before they were Sonic Youth. It had previously been owned by a member of Moore's pre-youth group, the Coachmen, and by 1988 all its frets had been stripped out. It had been restrung with 4 bass strings, and was mostly held together by duct tape. Moore played it with a drumstick, revving unholy bar chords from this affront to Les Paul.
My cup is full.
Mike Watt's contribution to Daydream Nation was an answering machine message he left Moore while on the road.
Watt here. I'm downstairs in this window. They're pulp booth.
Asking if he ever found those misplaced cables, which was entangled into the haunted piano sound collage, Providence.
Did you find your shit? You gotta watch the motor thirst in your fucking memory. This goes out the window.
The sound at the end of the piece is one of the band's amps literally blowing up. An inevitability after Ronaldo asked Sansano to keep his guitar levels so loud as to always remain in the red. Though they had the backing of Enigma and a budget of $30,000, they remained in New York. Over a particularly hot few weeks, Moore would start his day by making the 20-minute walk to the studio, catching some inspiration on the way. Part B of the trilogy, Hyperstation, was also where the album got its title, Moore commenting on the contentedly somnambulistic population of Reagan's America, a populace unaware of the nightmare they were enduring. Things could have been so much better if Jay Mascis was in charge. Daydream Nation was released in October 1988. Sonic Youth always took great pride in the album covers. The blazing scarecrow of Bad Moon Rising, the lurid B-movie still of EVOL, the mixed media collage of Sister. Daydream Nation was no different. The band selected a painting by German visual artist, an associate of the band, Gerhard Richter, though the candle reflected the Moore track of the same name. Gordon had her own reasons. To me, Gerhard's cover was an aesthetic Trojan horse decision, disguising subversion under a benign exterior, just as the Reagan 80s concealed torment and volatility. Upon release, it continued the band's ascent. While Sonic Youth were never going to be the band to sell millions of records, it was their first to chart briefly on the UK album chart, albeit at number 99. Its lead single, Teenage Riot, would manage to remain on the Billboard Modern Rock chart for 9 weeks, peaking at number 20 in February 1989. But it was critically where the album truly made its mark. When the Paz and Jop list was revealed, Daydream Nation was placed at number 2, behind only Public Enemy's It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back. British Music Weekly's NME and Melody Maker gave Sonic Youth their respective year-end top spots. The band were characteristically nonplussed. When someone told Moore the album was at number 1 on the CMJ chart, he asked, "When will we get to 0? This greater exposure made major labels more rabid to secure the signatures of Sonic Youth. The band was still hesitant. They'd seen Husker Du and The Replacements signed to Warner Brothers and Sire respectively, gain a bump in sales, but release albums they perceived to be of a worse standard than their independent releases. We met with a lot of labels after Daydream Nation. Geffen was still small compared to other majors. It was still technically an independent label run by David Geffen. That soon changed after we signed with them, the mergers with MCA and other labels, which was a little bit of a letdown. We all liked the buzz that they had with this rock band Guns N' Roses at the time, and they seemed to be doing well. The Geffen A&R guy who signed Sonic Youth was Mark Cates, who'd come up working on college radio, so was the ideal person to shepherd an alternative rock band into the mainstream. And while that didn't really happen for Sonic Youth, both Nirvana and Beck signed with Cates and Geffen because Sonic Youth had made them seem like the cool major label, and therefore were an essential step in Nirvana's paradigm-shifting success. Sonic Youth would end up releasing their best-selling albums with Geffen in the 90s. 1990's Goo, 92's Dirty, and 94's experimental Jet Set, Trash, and No Star.
Betting on the bull and the heather.
Though none would gain certification in the US, Goo would go silver in the UK. But Daydream Nation was the record all their others would be rated against, and be the one singled out for best ever lists. In 2007, the All Tomorrow's Party Festival managed to convince the famously nostalgia-allergic band to play the record in full, and relearning the songs proved enlightening. Listening to the Daydream Nation master tapes, I was amazed at how crude my guitar takes were, especially Rain King, which I had to decode. Like, what the fuck tuning was that, and where were my fingers on the guitar? Because it sounded like I was playing rotten guitar strings on a piece of wood. And then it would break into this kind of hard rock riff. It sounds great, but when you listen to just one element of it, like my guitar, it sounds like I don't know how to play. Like I'm playing with gloves on. I would never accept a guitar take like that today. In the same way that the band had blended everything around them to create their singular noisy rock, Sonic Youth became a calling point for thousands of alt-leaning groups.
Is she pretty on the inside? Is she pretty from the back?
She's so like a days ago. Should have been a West Coast bride. Whatever you want from me, whatever you want, I'll do.
Why control you? Whoa, 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 whoa. Wash away what we create. Nothing ever happened to me. Nothing ever happened.
But their influence is everywhere. Just like how No Wave had revolutionized Kim Gordon, various Riot Girls saw her on stage with her cool style and limited but expressive musical ability, and thought, that could be me. Sleater-Kinney's I Wanna Be Your Joey Ramone has Carrie Brownstein stating her intention to be your personal guitar hero, like Thirst and More. Dave Grohl was convinced he'd ripped off Schizophrenia for Everlong. Neil Young would not only ask the band out on tour in 1991, but he would reveal Expressway to Your Skull to be his favourite guitar track ever. Not to mention the many indie bands that spell your, YR, because of Sonic Youth.
What's your take on Cassidy's? What's your take on Cassidy's?
I don't know too much. I just got the keys.
Interviewers would say, "Why are you significant?" or "How does it feel to be influential?" And it became this catchphrase, whereas nobody actually talked about why we were influential. We were influential in showing people that you can make any kind of music you want. And that's the thing. When Spin magazine controversially placed Thurston Moore and Lee Ranaldo at the top of their 100 greatest guitarists of all time list in 2012, especially when standards like Hendrix, Clapton and Beck were omitted, there was outrage. But why not them? Not only is their guitar interplay incredibly fluid, combative and soulful, they recontextualized how guitars are supposed to be played, and how they sound. And other bands took that invention and experimentation and ran with it. Why replicate your idols when you can just kill them outright? That is the power of Sonic Youth. Thanks for watching. What is your favourite Sonic Youth song? Comment down below. If you like this video, like, subscribe, and why don't you also do me a favour and share it with a couple of people. It really does help. As always, I'd like to shout out this month's new supporters over on Patreon: Julian Harlow, Brian Hook and Mike Wexelberger. Also a massive thanks to Matt Gears for sending me 4 records off my Amazon wishlist. Most of this script was written while Aphex Twin spun in the background. Thank you, and thanks to all that support me. And I'll see you in 3 weeks' time for a dose of 2000s rock.